Hey gang, I did not drown. Hooray. But I lost my hanky. Now we're gonna have to keep a special eye out for snakes until I get home. And I'm almost home. I don't know where I am. I woke up on a bunch of rocks, which is great because I love rocks. So I'm pretty lonely. I had a bunch of leeches on my back and they're gone. But it was kind of sad saying goodbye because I haven't talked to anybody for a while now. My next nature hack is make sure you bring a friend to nature, because nature's not a great place to meet friends. It's mostly trees and stuff. So we did bring a friend into nature. I brought him in a bag to meet the park ranger, to show the park ranger that I have a sense of humor. Because look at this, isn't this the funniest thing you ever saw? Right now it may not look like a whole lot, but wait until you see it in action. We're gonna get a little seat for our friend so our friend can talk to us and we can hang out with our good pal in nature. Now that's a good seat. So if you have a friend, that's not a good rock anyway, so we're gonna leave that rock. Let's get this rock. I'm gonna avoid horse. I stepped in, okay. Are you ready to see this guy in action? Sorry, I got a lot of dirt on you. My next hack is to talk to your friend. Ask them how they're doing. Tell them how you're doing. Don't be afraid to be vulnerable. You're in the woods and no one can hear you. Gonna wind him up. Hey buddy, how's it going? Yeah. What did you just say? No, I'm doing fine. Say, buddy, I wish I had teeth like you. Say, little buddy, I wish you would stop interrupting me. No, my dad's looking for me. You don't know anything about him. Let's go try to find some other friends. I got a bee on me. Hello, bee. My name is Gary. I am a fun and non-violent guy. Hey gang, did you know that B actually stands for the best? Because that is what you are. Please, don't sting me. I am a friend to the bees. I would never sting you. Not in a million years. Say what, B? I'm gonna go now. Let's do this again sometime. What does your week look like? Okay, we'll work something out. It was nice talking to you, B.